In the mid-1920s, the Regia Marina looked to expand and counter the growing threat of the Marine Nationale in the Mediterranean as the French had augmented their cruiser and destroyer forces with newer and more capable vessels, leading the Regia Marina to create the new Zara-class, of which we will discuss the only ship of the class not to be sunk at Cape Matapan, Gorizia. She was completed in December 1931, and throughout the 1930s, she participated in naval reviews, drills, and other activities, namely the Spanish Civil War and Berlin Olympics. When Italy joined the Second World War in June 1940, she was in the 1st Cruiser Division with her sisters Zara and Fiume. She participated in the Battle of Calabria, the Battle of Cape Spartivento, missing Cape Matapan, the first and second battles of Sirte. However, after being heavily damaged by Allied bombers while in La Maddalena in Sardinia in 1943, she was transferred to La Spezia for repairs, which, due to the subsequent Italian armistice and German occupation of the port city, would never come. Eventually, she was broken up in 1947, where, to quote Maurizio Brescia and Augusto de Toro in their book Italian Heavy Cruisers Trento de Bolzano, they write, "Except the Gorizia, the war gave no opportunity to demonstrate the fighting qualities of the Zara-class, which was nevertheless held in high regard even by the enemy. The loss of Zara and the Fiume at Matapan cannot be taken as a criticism of their protection because the damage received would have been fatal for any type of warship. A similar consideration could be made for the Blucher lost in Oslo Fjord on April 9, 1940. However, the events surrounding the loss of the Pola are astonishing today, especially when compared to the notable resilience demonstrated by the Gorizia during the bombardment of La Maddalena. Where our story starts, Gorizia's fate is over a decade away. For the sake of our story, we'll start in the beginning of 1928, where the Franco-Italian rivalry was in full swing as the Trento-class was just about to come into service, and the Marine Nationale was countering with their own new class, and more to come, not to mention the various light cruisers and destroyers being built. To get some perspective on this rivalry, we will look at the Franco-Italian Rivalry, Current History 1916 to 1940, Volume 38, Number 3 by B.Z. Goldberg, from June of 1933, where he writes, France still finds it difficult to see in Italy an adversary worthy of the name. She has not forgotten the adage of Metternich that Italy is not a nation, but a geographical expression, nor can she forget how Italy rose to nationhood. Since Napoleon concluded the hasty armistice at Villafranca, France has been trying to curb Italian aspirations. In such a policy, Italy finds grounds for deep resentment, to which the division of spoils at Versailles had only added. Before Italy entered the war, she was promised, in case of victory, a good portion of the German colonies in Africa and valuable land along the Adriatic. But when victory came, France helped herself to 253,000 square miles of territory with 6,466,000 inhabitants, while Great Britain obtained 989,000 square miles with a population of 9,323,000. Against this, Italy's share was meager indeed, 23,726 square miles with 1,672,000 inhabitants. Dalmatia, the most important territory promised, was denied her. For Fiume, she has to thank D'Annunzio, not her allies in war. What rankles even more is the French refusal to recognize Italy's contribution to the common victory. Italy's declaration of neutrality in the beginning enabled France to concentrate all her forces against the Germans. Later, Italy prevented the Austro-Hungarian army from fighting in France. To not fall behind, the admirals of the Regia Marina looked to design and build new warships. Discussions ranged from the construction of new medium displacement battleships of about 23,000 tons to smaller vessels like heavy cruisers. In these discussions, the weaknesses of the Trento-class were discussed, with some of the leaders feeling they were too vulnerable and that the Italian Navy should strive for qualitative superiority over France. For the uninitiated in naval design at the time, this translates to they were planning on breaking the naval treaties, where the Regia Marina came to some conclusions. To take from Maurizio Brescia and Augusto de Toro again, displacement should not be fixed a priori, first, and therefore the 10,000-ton requirement of the Treaty of Washington should not be taken into account. An extensive vertical protection of 200 millimeters should be ensured, together with strong horizontal protection and a robust hull structure. The main armament was to be maintained at 8 203mm guns, As for large light cruisers, a few knots of speed could be given up compared to the Trento, ensuring a maximum speed in operational conditions of 32 knots instead of 35. Not everyone was thrilled about the idea of breaking the Washington Naval Treaty, namely the Ministry of the Navy, where they stipulated that these new cruisers should fall under the treaty stipulations, meaning that to do so, the ambitious armor scheme had to be cut down. The main characteristics of the ships when constructed were a 10,000-ton standard displacement, although when complete it was more like 11,900, 8 203mm guns, a maximum speed of 32 knots, and only 150mm of vertical protection, and 70mm of horizontal protection. The reduction of speed and increase in armor is an interesting point, as it marks a kind of shift in the thinking of the Regia Marina, where I think another quote is apt. The reduction of 3 knots in speed concerning the Trentos was not considered a disadvantage from a tactical point of view, as it could not be assumed that Italian ships would engage the enemy only if they had a higher speed than all the ships they might encounter. Greater defensive qualities, therefore, and not superior speed, as a rising young star of Italian naval thinking, Giuseppe Fioravanzo, would soon theorize. With these first two ships, the Italian Navy adopted the criterion that, since quantitative superiority could not be achieved, qualitative superiority should be sought through the development of hidden qualities, capable of gaining the upper hand on the battlefield. Like other Italian heavy cruisers of the period, Gorizia and the other ships of the class were named after Italian cities that were acquired after the Great War. Gorizia was laid down on March 30th, 1930, launched on December 28th, 1930, and completed on December 23rd, 1931. She displaced 11,900 tons standard displacement and almost 15,000 tons full load. Her armament consisted of 8 203mm guns and twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. Originally, she carried 16 120mm guns, which in 1937 was reduced to 12, along with having various light anti-aircraft guns ranging from the 13.2mm machine gun to 37mm guns. Her machinery consisted of 8 boilers that gave steam to 2 shafted geared turbines, giving 110,000 shaft horsepower on trials and 35.2 knots. In operational conditions, it was more like 30 to 31 knots. Her armor scheme was 150mm of armor at the waterline, a 70mm main deck, and a 150mm conning tower, with the face of the turrets being the same. Also, for those who don't like me using RN when discussing the Regia Marina, I raise you this photo. After being handed over to the Regia Marina and finally entering service as part of the 2nd Cruiser Squadron following some reorganization, she became the flagship in early 1933, and interestingly enough, led that squadron in August to southern France, a rare occasion during this period. Besides drill and reviews, things were quiet until July 25th, 1936, when Gorizia, with Admiral Riccardo Palladini aboard, sailed for the Berlin Olympics. She did have some business to attend to first, as she stopped off near Gijón in Spain to protect Italian citizens as clashes between the nationalist and anarcho-communist forces had reached the area. This was followed by a pit stop in France, where the ship was generally well received, and then on the 8th of August, she arrived in Kiel, remaining until the 19th, where she was visited by German officials. While en route back to Italy, Gorizia experienced an explosion of gasoline vapors in the seaplane fuel stowage, which blew 25 square meter gashes on both sides of the bow. There were no casualties, but the integrity of the hull was compromised, and therefore they needed to make emergency repairs. This occurred in Tangier on the North African coast, which didn't have the facilities to repair the ship. Gorizia went to Gibraltar after agreements with the British were made, and while she was there, the British were allowed to find out the real weight of the vessel to assist with repairs and see they are well over the treaty limits. Gorizia was ready to return to Italy by the 9th of September, and the British didn't do anything about the treaty violation because they didn't want to strain relations with Rome further, as things weren't great because of the ongoing war with Ethiopia. Further repairs were carried out, and the ship was finally back and operational by early October. The rest of the pre-war period for Gorizia wasn't that exciting, so let's move on to the start of the Second World War in the Mediterranean. By May 1940, before Italy had joined the war, a naval directive was issued on May 29th that pointed to how the Regia Marina would operate in the war, where Maurizio Brescia and Augusto de Toro and Italian battleships Conte de Cavour and Duilio classes, 1911 to 1956, hindering the transfer of forces between the two basins of the Mediterranean, taking advantage of every occasion in which the Italian Navy had partially superior or equal forces, engaging the bulk of enemy forces as soon as possible, on condition that those forces had not been reinforced, and that the encounter could take place not far from Italian bases, to defend shipping to Libya and Albania, and acting with stealth, light units and aircraft near enemy bases, and against his lines of communication. So when Italy joined the Second World War in June, Gorizia was serving in the 1st Cruiser Division with her sisters Fiume and Zara, ready for action under the command of Admiral Pellegrino Metucci. Unlike the Italian army in North Africa, which faced supply and logistics issues, ports like Tripoli, Benghazi, or Tobruk had not been properly readied for war. This leads us to early July, when an important Italian convoy consisting of a passenger liner and 5 freighters, loaded with a little over 2,000 men, tanks, vehicles, and critically, 16,000 tons of fuel and other supplies, departed Naples and Catania for Benghazi on July 6th for an offensive against Egypt. Initially, only the 2nd Cruiser Squadron, the 10th Destroyer Squadron, and 6 torpedo boats had been allocated to escort the convoy. Once learning the British were putting out in force for a different reason, the Regia Marina put out with 2 battleships, the Conte de Cavour and Giulio Cesare, along with 6 light cruisers and 20 destroyers from Taranto, led by Vice Admiral Ennio Campioni, along with Vice Admiral Riccardo Palladini aboard his flagship Pola, his 6 heavy cruisers, including Gorizia, 4 light cruisers, and 16 destroyers from several bases in Sicily. After going over the naval directive, it makes sense why the Italians would put out in such force. After Mers el-Kabir, the British position in the Mediterranean was strained. To help strengthen it, the British intended to re-establish Malta as a major base, which had been effectively abandoned by the Royal Navy for fear of bombing attacks, wherein it was decided to reduce the number of non-combatant servicemen and dependents on the island. These were to be removed in 2 small convoys. Admiral Andrew Cunningham was to interpose his Mediterranean fleet between these convoys and the likely route Italian surface forces would take. Simultaneously, Force H under James Somerville would create a diversion by raiding Cagliari on Sardinia, where, to quote Bagnesco and De Toro again, from Alexandria, the Mediterranean fleet was to furnish cover, split into 3 groups. Force A with the 7th Cruiser Division, Light Cruiser Orion, Vice Admiral John Tovey, with Neptune, Liverpool, and Gloucester, and 1 destroyer. Force B with the battleship Warspite, flagship of the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, Admiral Andrew B. Cunningham, and 5 destroyers. Force C with the 1st Battleship Division, Royal Sovereign in Malaya, the aircraft carrier Eagle, and 11 destroyers. These groups were to sail from Alexandria at midnight on July 7th, proceeding until they met 120 miles east of Cape Passero, then to continue towards the Italian coast. The Royal Air Force RAF was to carry out reconnaissance from July 8th to July 13th in the central eastern Mediterranean. Finally, on the morning of July 8th, leaving from Gibraltar on a separate mission, an air attack on Cagliari, was Force H, battlecruiser Hood, Vice Admiral James Somerville, with the battleships Valiant and Resolution, the carrier Ark Royal, 3 light cruisers, and 10 destroyers. The British were spotted on the 7th by an Italian submarine, and the following morning, on the 8th, the British submarine Phoenix sighted the enemy main body, reporting it as midway between Italy and Benghazi, heading south. The convoy the Italian main body was protecting reached North Africa later, delivering the supplies. At 10 a.m., an Italian aircraft flew out of the Dodecanese in Libya, subjecting Cunningham's fleet to a series of high-level bombing attacks, with 1 bomb hitting the cruiser Gloucester and near misses damaging Warspite and Malaya, while at 3 p.m., the Italian main body turned eastward to meet the British as the British steered roughly northwest. Decoded British radio signals led the Italians to expect Cunningham off the Calabrian coast at noon on the 9th, with Mussolini ordering Campioni to postpone battle so the Regia Aeronautica could attack the British the next day. By 6:40, both Italian fleets, Palladini's cruisers and Campioni's battleships, were headed north-northwest. The morning of the 9th at 7:32 a.m., Sunderlands from Malta found Campioni's fleet and tracked him for nearly 4 hours. It gave enough time for Eagle to launch an airstrike, but not until 1:15 p.m. did a group of 9 swordfish find Palladini's cruisers, launching torpedoes at Zara and some of the other heavy cruisers, which all missed. The sight of carrier planes told Campione that British warships were nearby. His cruisers launched 6 more float planes, one of which located the British 80 miles away to the northeast. Campione, who had maneuvered his forces around, began to reverse course back to engage the enemy, where at 1:10 he received instructions concerning an engagement. This comes from Bagnesco and De Toro. Meanwhile, at 1:10, instructions had arrived from Marina concerning the criteria to be followed in any encounter. Not to distance themselves too far from aeronaval bases to allow preemptive or contemporaneous air attacks, to engage, if possible, the enemy battleships separately, being aware of the different speeds, delaying surface contact to allow the Air Force to do damage to the enemy, to withdraw the battleships at sunset, to engage the torpedo craft at night. Cunningham headed northwest until 2:15 p.m. when satisfied he had positioned himself in between Campione and Taranto, his ships steaming in the 3 groups I mentioned previously, with Tovi's cruisers first spotting smoke on the horizon a half an hour later at 2:47. Gloucester had been sent to support Eagle, leaving a limited amount of cruisers. Gorizia and the other heavy cruisers were swinging into position at 3:20 and began engaging the British cruisers and battleships. After the shooting faded away for a time, and Campione steered to engage Warspite and the other British battleships, Gorizia and the other heavy cruisers were ahead of Cesare, engaging Tovi's light cruisers as the battleships fought with their heavy guns. Tovi was at a distinct disadvantage facing the Italian heavy and light cruisers. By a little after 4 p.m., Tovi was overtaken by Palladini and Pola and the other Italian cruisers. However, when Giulio Cesare was hit by Warspite, it caused Campione to react and order his forces to retreat, not knowing the extent of the damage to his battleship. At 4:06, Palladini was ordered to withdraw. Gorizia, at that same time, witnessed the attack by the 11th Destroyer Squadron, the 3rd Italian destroyer attack of the battle. The squadron turned to their port side, cutting between Gorizia and Fiume. A forest of shell splashes surrounded the leading destroyer, and the destroyers soon launched their torpedoes, retiring unharmed. The Italians continued to retire to their bases, while British aircraft spotted them. However, after reorganizing his forces, Cunningham retired to Malta, thus concluding the battle. After the battle, there was time to reflect. From De Toro and Bagnesco, in conclusion, both fleets accomplished their respective missions, allowing their convoys to reach their destinations unharmed. On the Italian side, it was the first wartime test of air-naval cooperation and employment at sea the air arm. Results were disappointing, and from certain aspects, worrying. They go on to describe how air reconnaissance was good, but the doctrine and execution of the air attacks were less than ideal, with about 2,000 bombs dropped by 500 aircraft and only 1 hit. This idea, which is described as the myth of moral ascendancy, is discussed in The Struggle for the Middle Sea, The Great Navies at War in the Mediterranean Theater, 1940 to 1945, by Vincent P. O'Hara, where he writes, "Overall, the battle's results heartened the Italian Navy, even if the subsequent bombardment by friendly aircraft proved frustrating." A midshipman from Eugenio expressed the mood when he wrote his mother the day after the battle. "After a happy baptism of fire, I am proud." Admiral Palladini wrote, "I think that one result that occurred in the battle, and not the least important, was the fact that all personnel, even the most humble, felt the deeply rooted conviction of the necessity and beauty of battle, and our ability to confront and beat the enemy." Following this, there was no action for Gorizia in the Middle Sea, besides covering convoys and several other smaller operations. After the raid on Taranto in early November 1940, in which Gorizia most likely shot down 1 swordfish, the air raid caused the reshuffling of the Regia Marina due to the damage and the fact that Taranto was no longer safe for fleet units. The British commenced another convoy operation to Malta, and then on to Alexandria. 3 Royal Navy fleets in the theater were used as either a covering force, in the case of Force H under James Somerville, and Force D, both from Gibraltar, or as a diversionary force in the case of the Mediterranean Fleet from Alexandria under the command of Cunningham. Once the Italian High Command, or Supermarina, learned about the convoy operation MB9, they put to sea on the 26th to interpose themselves between the convoy and Malta. 2 Italian fleets consisting of the First Fleet with the battleships Vittorio Veneto and Giulio Cesare, along with destroyers under the command of Admiral Campione, as well as the 2nd Italian Fleet under Admiral Iachino with Gorizia, the other heavy and light Italian cruisers and destroyers. The two sides began spotting each other early on the morning of the 27th and maneuvered around each other to get in position for the battle and to cover the convoy in the case of the British forces. Late in the morning, Somerville and HMS Renown began to get a bearing on what Italian ships he was facing and started to turn towards the enemy and requested Ark Royal range a strike to attack the Italian fleet coming towards his direction. By 12:15, Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, in charge of Somerville's cruisers, was pushing north with Somerville's flagship Renown pushing 27.5 knots in support of them. Somerville ordered destroyers 10,000 yards northeast of Renown to push away any Italian destroyer counterattack. While on the Italian side at about 12:15, Vice Admiral Pellegrino Matucci, in charge of the 1st Cruiser Division including Pola, Fiume, and Gorizia, was heading east at 28 knots in line ahead, with Vice Admiral Sansonetti's 3rd Cruiser Division not too far behind. They soon encountered Holland's cruisers, and Matucci ordered his division to open fire, despite direct orders not to by Campioni. Matucci judged that the situation, not apparent from Campione's flagship, warranted action. Nevertheless, Gorizia and the other Italian heavy cruisers began engaging the British at long range, as Italian doctrine dictated, with Gorizia engaging a British light cruiser. They changed course to port away from the British line, while Sansonetti's 3rd cruisers began making smoke, a brisk gunnery duel between the British ships in range and the Italian cruisers. Once Renown began engaging the Italian cruisers, they began to disengage, with the 3rd Division disappearing into their smoke and the 1st Division going beyond the horizon shortly after. As this was going on, Ark Royal launched aircraft that began striking Italian ships, including Campione's flagship Vittorio Veneto, not hitting the ship. The two sides continued to engage throughout the afternoon, which, to summarize the outcome of the day from the Italian perspective, this is what O'Hara has to say. As for Campione, although he had the mandate to be conservative, he had presided over the loss of Italy's best opportunity to deal the British a sharp setback in a fleet action. As Iachino remarked, the use of these ships, which constituted at that moment nearly all of our fleet's effective units after the blow at Taranto, was decided by Supermarina mainly for the reasons of morale and to demonstrate that our combative spirit remained intact, but Campione's days of command at sea were numbered. Following this battle, Gorizia didn't have much action. When March 1941 rolled around, she was undergoing some work in dock and therefore missed the disastrous Battle of Cape Matapan, where all 3 of her sisters, Zara, Fiume, and Pola, were sunk at close range by the Mediterranean fleet. It turns out to not be sunk at Cape Matapan, don't be there. But to quote Maurizio Brescia in his book Mussolini's Navy, a reference guide to the Regia Marina, 1930 to 1945, the 4 Zara-class ships were surely the best Italian heavy cruisers, and the exceptional conditions of the loss of Zara and Fiume at Matapan, wrecked by 15-inch shells fired at almost point-blank range, do not allow a fair judgment of their robustness to be made. At the Battle of Spartivento, Pola hit the cruiser HMS Barrack with 2 8-inch shells, knocking out one of her 8-inch turrets. In the brief gunfire of the action of the First Battle of Sirte in December 1941, Gorizia damaged the destroyer HMS Kipling with a near miss. With that, the Italians were down to Trento, Trieste, Bolzano, and Gorizia, which is pretty interesting since the Regia Marina tended to operate the cruisers with their sisters. Since Trento and Trieste were sisters, and Bolzano was more closely related to those two, it made operating the remaining heavy cruisers pretty interesting. Anyway, things were quiet for Gorizia, with opportunities for action coming in the summer and fall of 1941, where the first real action for Gorizia didn't come until December 1941, with the First Battle of Sirte. There isn't much to say about the engagement as it was short due to the poor weather and rough seas, with it being inconclusive. Still, the overall goals for either side of supplying forces on the African continent was achieved. Bagnesco and De Toro write, "In the end, only the destroyer Kipling was superficially damaged by bombs, and a 203mm shell from the Gorizia exploded nearby, resulting in 1 casualty and the destruction of the radio aerials. But in the aftermath of the battle, the British lost ships to mines, and it was not too long after the Italians successfully infiltrated Alexandria with their frogmen and sank Queen Elizabeth and Valiant at anchor in the harbor's shallow waters, putting them out of action for a time. Gorizia next fought in the awful weather of the Second Battle of Sirte on the 22nd of March 1942, where again, the Italian forces led by Admiral Iachino, this time on his flagship Littorio, joined by the destroyer squadrons and the Gorizia group, with the heavy cruisers Gorizia and Trento, and the light cruiser Bandineri, under the command of Admiral Perona. At 2:20, the Italian forces were spotted by the British forces, commanded by Admiral Philip Vian, with a mixture of cruisers and destroyers under his command, escorting several merchant vessels that had left Alexandria on the 20th, and were met by Vian early on the 22nd, as it was reported that Perona and Iachino had left to intercept this British convoy. Vian did not command the firepower to engage the Italian ships, with his orders being to evade enemy if possible until dark, when the convoy dispersed if it seemed advisable, was to be sent onto Malta with the Hunt-class destroyers, and the remaining warships were to attack the enemy. Axis air attacks had previously peppered the convoy, and was the reason why at 2:20, lookouts on Gorizia were able to spot the British forces as their flanks stood out in the poor weather. The British forces split into their groups above, with the convoy and escorts heading southwest, while the strike force formed columns and headed west by northwest. Perona's cruisers engaged the British forces first at 2:35 at 20,000 yards, with the British forces responding in kind, with both sides shooting well, especially in the foul weather, both sides bracketing one another. By 3:13, the fighting had fallen silent, and Vian turned to rejoin the convoy. The Italian forces met up with the Littorio and the Italian cruisers, spotting a British cruiser again at 4:17. The two sides continuing to rough the terrible weather conditions and each other's fire for the next half an hour, lasting until 4:52, when poor visibility rendered shooting pointless. Fighting picked back up a short time later when HMS Dido fired on Trento or Gorizia, with the two sides dipping in and out of view until close to 7 p.m., with the Italian forces being successful in delaying the British convoy long enough to where even the faster merchant ships came under heavy air attack the following morning and the coming days, with the merchant ships being sunk in the process, along with some of the escorting vessels sustaining serious damage in the engagement. The island fortress of Malta was still holding out in June 1942, despite constant air harassment, with the civilian population down to a daily diet of 1,200 to 1,500 calories a day. Malta's governor estimated it had 2 months before starvation forced them to surrender. Therefore, there were two operations to bring supplies to Malta, one from the west codenamed Operation Harpoon, and one from the east codenamed Vigorous. Supermarina knew a large convoy operation was in the works, and air attacks against Taranto in early June led to the understanding that the enemy would make its major efforts in the eastern basin. Vigorous left on June 12th, and only 2 days later did the powerful Italian force, consisting of the battleships Littorio and Vittorio Veneto, heavy cruisers Trento and Gorizia, light cruisers and destroyers, departed Taranto under the command of Iachino. The Allied convoys came under air attacks, and Vian, again guarding the convoys with light cruisers and destroyers, was ordered to reverse course back to Alexandria and then to Malta several times throughout the next 2 days due to the sustained air attacks and the threat of the Italian battleships and cruiser forces, being a victory for the Italians as the supplies from Operation Vigorous did not reach Malta, with O'Hara writing, "Battles do not always require direct combat. The Vigorous convoy battle was one of the Italian fleet's major victories. The threat of the battleships, a threat established by Iachino in March, created the conditions that allowed Axis air and light surface forces to attack repeatedly, and the threat of battleships ultimately caused the massive convoy to turn away, something air power alone never accomplished." Gorizia and the other Italian heavy cruisers came under heavy fire from Allied aircraft during this time. The operation saw the end of the cruiser Trento, as she was torpedoed first by a Beaufort from Malta, and then finished off by a torpedo from the submarine Umbra. Not only that, by the end of the action, Gorizia was the only heavy cruiser operable in the 3rd Division, as all the others had sustained serious damage. By August, though, the 3rd Division was somewhat back to operational order with the remaining cruisers, and was part of the only surface fleets to be committed against Operation Pedestal, in which the small British submarine Unbroken ambushed the Italian cruisers when they came between the islands of Stromboli and Salina, north of Sicily, as they were going back to Naples. Gorizia happened to be turning to port to launch a seaplane when several torpedoes passed the cruiser, while the Bolzano was less lucky, being struck on the port side just after the bridge, where although she was recovered, it was effectively the end of her service, which for Gorizia was not too far off. By April of the following year, things in the Mediterranean weren't going too well for the Axis forces, as the Allies advanced on Tunisia, the last of the Axis holdouts on North Africa, and the United States Army Air Force began more and more operations to bomb Italian and German shipping to Tunisia. Not only that, but the naval bases that were ostensibly protecting the shipping, places like La Maddalena, where Gorizia was stationed along with Trieste. Where on the 10th of April, while the ships were in La Maddalena in Sardinia, a large air raid of 84 B-17 bombers began appearing overhead at 2:30 p.m. The bombers were flying at high elevation, which nullified the anti-aircraft fire the Axis forces were putting up, and soon 1,000-pound bombs were falling on the cruisers. Three 1,000-pound bombs fell near Trieste, eventually causing the cruiser to capsize at 4:13, where Bagnesco and De Toro write, "The Gorizia was almost simultaneously framed by numerous bombs, estimated at 60, although here the B-17 drops did not appear to be as accurate. She was, nevertheless, hit by three 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs, while others exploded in the immediate vicinity. The cruiser was badly shaken and damaged. However, the skill and the efficiency of the damage control parties prevented the sinking and kept the vital parts of the ship in a reasonable enough working state. It should be noted that the overall efficiency of the cruiser on April 1st was estimated at 80% of its maximum, to which deficiencies in electrical equipment contributed. Effectively, the 3rd Cruiser Division ceased to exist. Still, Gorizia proved to be salvageable and made the journey to La Spezia on the 14th of April, with work progress being slow due to the bombings and prioritizing other ships. It was estimated that the work would have been finished by the 30th of November, but on the 8th of September, after the signing of the armistice, she was still dry docked, where the commander Carlo Desi decided to sabotage the cruiser by letting in water into the dry dock and opening the intakes to let water into the ship, but the operation was immediately suspended, and she would be eventually moved into the roadstead where she was found by the advancing Allies in 1945, half submerged. Having no reuse value, the ship was refloated and sent to scrapping in 1947. I'll close out with the same quote I used to describe the Battle of Cape Matapan. The 4 Zara-class ships were surely the best Italian heavy cruisers, and the exceptional conditions of the loss of Zara and Fiume at Matapan, wrecked by 15-inch shells fired at almost point-blank range, do not allow for a fair judgment of their robustness to be made. At the Battle of Capo Toluda, Pola hit the cruiser HMS Barrack with 2 8-inch shells, knocking out one of her 8-inch turrets. In the brief gunfire action of the First Battle of Sirte in December 1941, Gorizia damaged the destroyer HMS Kipling with a near miss. Gorizia was a truly beautiful ship, just like her other sisters who were sunk at Matapan. It isn't fair to judge their robustness based on that action, as Gorizia proved to be resilient in the bombing at La Maddalena. Thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.